Morwen's mirror, come close to the fire, and let me tell you about mirrors and the lies they tell. About a woman who thought she knew what she wanted until she saw what she'd lost. About the poison of comparison and the terrible gift of seeing the life you might have lived. This is a story about Morwen, High Priestess of Avalon, who discovered that some doors are better left unopened, some questions better left unasked, some truths more dangerous than any lie. The discovery: Morwen found the mirror on a day when winter had settled deep into Avalon's bones, when the mists hung so thick and cold that even the apple trees looked gray and distant, when the boundary between worlds felt particularly thin and magic moved sluggish and strange through the frozen air. She'd been searching through the oldest vaults beneath the stone circle, through chambers that predated even the current priestess's grandmothers, through spaces filled with artifacts and relics from times when magic worked differently, when the rules weren't quite the same, when the priestesses who'd walked these paths had understood things that had been lost or deliberately forgotten because the knowing of them was too dangerous to preserve. She was looking for records, for references to the ritual Elaine had performed 2 years ago, trying to understand whether the Threshold Keeper needed additional training or support, trying to be responsible leader and attentive sister, even though both roles felt heavier lately, felt like weights she carried without quite understanding why they'd grown so burdensome. The vault was cluttered with centuries of accumulation, with things deemed too powerful to use but too significant to destroy, with magical objects that carried histories and purposes no one quite remembered anymore. Clay tablets inscribed in languages that predated Latin, staffs carved from wood of trees that no longer grew anywhere in the mortal world, bowls used for scrying that held shadows even in full light. And there, tucked behind a broken loom and covered in dust so thick it looked like gray velvet, was a mirror. It was larger than most scrying mirrors, nearly as tall as Morwen herself, framed in silver worked with patterns that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally, that suggested meanings and purposes that slipped away from conscious understanding. The surface was dark, not reflecting the light from her torch, not showing anything at all until she reached out and wiped away some of the dust. Then she saw her reflection. But it wasn't quite right. The woman looking back at her had Morwen's face but not her expression, had her gray eyes but with different light in them, had her dark hair but worn loose instead of in the practical braids Morwen always wore. And the reflection was smiling, actually smiling, with an ease and joy that Morwen couldn't remember ever feeling, with a lightness that suggested this other version had never carried the weight Morwen carried every moment of every day. She stepped back, heart hammering, understanding flooding through her with the intuition that came from years of magical training, from decades of learning to recognize enchanted objects and understand their properties through observation and feeling rather than through explicit instruction. This wasn't a simple mirror. This was a scrying glass that showed not what was but what might have been. Not reality but possibility. Not the life you lived but the life you could have lived if different choices had been made. If different paths had been taken. If fate had turned just slightly to the left or right at some crucial moment. She knew she should leave it, should seal this vault and mark it forbidden, should tell the other priestesses that dangerous magic lived here and needed to be neutralized or bound. Morwen had warned her about mirrors like this, about the poison they carried, about how seeing what might have been could destroy your ability to live with what actually was. But Morwen didn't leave. She stood there staring at the reflection that wasn't quite her reflection, at the woman who wore her face but lived some other life, at the version of herself who smiled like someone who'd never known the crushing weight of responsibility, the isolation of leadership, the burden of being the one everyone looked to, the one who couldn't afford weakness or uncertainty or doubt. She reached out and touched the mirror's surface, and it rippled like water. And suddenly she could see more than just a face. She could see a room, simple wooden walls, sunlight streaming through a window, the sound of children laughing somewhere nearby. She could see her reflection turning away from the mirror toward someone calling her name. Could see the other Morwen's face light up with uncomplicated joy. Could see her move toward the door with the easy grace of someone who'd never spent hours in meditation holding herself perfectly still, who'd never learned to move like priestess, who'd never been trained to carry herself with the dignity and authority that Morwen's position required. The vision faded, and the mirror returned to showing just the face, just the smile, just the suggestion of happiness that felt as foreign and impossible as flight. Morwen stood there breathing hard, her hands shaking slightly, knowing she was standing at a crossroads, knowing that what she did in the next moment would matter, would shape what came after, would determine whether she remained the person she'd been or became something else. She should leave the mirror, should seal this vault, should forget what she'd seen. But the image of that smile haunted her. The sound of that laughter echoed in her mind. And before she could talk herself out of it, she was levitating the mirror, wrapping it in cloth to hide what it was, carrying it through the corridors to her private chambers where no one would question what she brought or what she did, where she was High Priestess and therefore entitled to privacy, entitled to secrets, entitled to keep some things to herself without explaining or justifying to anyone. She set the mirror in the corner of her room where it couldn't be easily seen from the door, where she could cover it with a tapestry when anyone visited, where she could pretend it was just furniture, just decoration, just something ordinary and harmless, instead of what it actually was, which was dangerous magic that should have been left buried, should have been forgotten, should never have been disturbed by someone who was already struggling under the weight of her life, already questioning the choices that had brought her here, already wondering sometimes in the dark of night whether power and purpose were adequate compensation for everything else she didn't have, everything else she'd never have, everything else that other people took for granted but that she'd traded away for magic and responsibility and the lonely honor of being the one who maintained Avalon, who kept the old ways alive, who bore the burden so others didn't have to. She told herself she would only look once more, only try to understand what the mirror was showing her, only glimpse this other life long enough to satisfy her curiosity, and then she would put it away, would cover it, would forget about it, and return to her actual existence, her real responsibilities, her true purpose. She told herself this even as she pulled the cloth away from the mirror's surface, even as she reached out to touch the dark glass, even as the visions began to flow and she saw with perfect clarity the life she would have lived if Vivian had made a different choice, had kept Elaine on Avalon and sent baby Morwen away instead, had decided that the daughter who stayed would be Elaine and the daughter who was given to the Christians would be her, would be Morwen, would be the one who grew up, knowing nothing of magic or destiny or the crushing weight of being chosen for greatness. The other Morwen, the visions came easier the second time, flowing without her having to work for them. As if the mirror recognized her now, as if it had been waiting for someone to look, as if it wanted to show her what she'd lost, what she'd never had, what had been denied to her by an accident of birth order, and her mother's decision to keep one daughter and send the other away. She saw herself as a child of 5, running through a village square while other children chased her, playing some game whose rules she didn't understand but whose joy was evident in the shrieking laughter, in the unself-conscious abandon of children who hadn't yet learned to perform or present or maintain dignity. This child Morwen fell and scraped her knee and cried not from pain but from the shock of falling, and a woman rushed over to comfort her, to brush dirt from her dress, to kiss the small hurt and make it better with nothing but love and attention and the simple magic of a parent's care. Morwen watched this and felt something crack in her chest because she'd never had that. Never had the casual comfort of a mother's kiss. Never had Vivian in that role, because by the time Morwen was old enough to remember clearly, Vivian was already High Priestess first, and Mother second, already more focused on training her successor than on simply loving her child, already preparing Morwen for the weight she would carry, already teaching her that emotions were to be controlled rather than expressed, that tears were weakness rather than release, that maintaining composure was more important than acknowledging hurt. The child in the mirror was allowed to be child in ways Morwen never was permitted to fall and cry and be comforted without shame, without the sense that showing pain was failure, without the constant awareness that she was being watched and evaluated and measured against impossible standards. The vision shifted, and she saw the village more clearly, saw where this other Morwen had grown up, the simple wooden buildings, the dirt roads, the communal well where women gathered to draw water and exchange gossip, the modest church at the center where the priest preached about sin and salvation and the one true God, while the villagers nodded and crossed themselves and tried to be good according to rules that made sense to them, even if they seemed arbitrary and constraining to someone raised in the old ways. She saw the other Morwen, at 8 years old, helping in the kitchen of the local inn, learning to cook and clean and serve, learning skills that were practical and useful but utterly mundane, learning nothing of magic or herb lore or the secret languages that moved power through the world. She saw her at 12 helping her adopted father in his carpentry shop, learning to measure and cut and join wood, learning to make simple furniture and useful tools, learning a trade that would let her support herself when she was grown, that would make her valuable to a community, that would give her place and purpose without requiring her to be special, or chosen, or destined. And the other Morwen was happy. That was the thing that struck Morwen most forcefully, that cut deepest, that hurt in ways she couldn't quite name. The girl in the mirror was happy in an uncomplicated way that Morwen had never experienced. Happy without the weight of knowing she was supposed to become something important. Happy without the constant pressure to excel and prove worthy and demonstrate that Vivian's faith in keeping her rather than Elaine had been justified. The other Morwen laughed easily, and often, she had friends who were just friends rather than subordinates or fellow priestesses with their own agendas. She had adoptive parents who loved her without expectations, without seeing her as investment in the future, without needing her to be anything other than their daughter. She had a community that accepted her as one of their own, without wondering whether she would become great or powerful or significant. She had, in short, everything Morwen didn't have, and had never had and would never have, because the path she'd been set on at birth didn't include casual happiness or uncomplicated relationships, or the simple joy of being ordinary. Morwen watched the visions unfold with growing hunger, with desperate attention. with the focus of someone dying of thirst watching water flow past just out of reach. She watched the other Morwen grow into a young woman, watched her help in the village, watched her become known for her kindness and her skill with her hands, watched her develop a reputation as someone reliable and good-hearted and pleasant to be around, watched her become exactly the kind of person who made communities function, who held society together, who mattered deeply to the people around her, even though she would never be remembered by history, would never have her name preserved in records, would never be anyone that people centuries later would tell stories about. And it was enough. That was what struck Morwen, what she couldn't quite accept or understand or reconcile with her own life. For the other Morwen, it was enough to be useful and loved and part of something larger than herself without having to lead it, or shape it, or bear responsibility for its continued existence. It was enough to contribute without having to be extraordinary. It was enough to matter to a small circle of people who knew her name and would mourn her passing without needing to matter to the ages, to history, to the vast sweep of time that would eventually forget even the greatest priestesses. Morwen watched this and felt envy so sharp it was nearly hatred, felt rage at fate that had given her power and purpose, but stolen simplicity and joy, felt grief for the childhood she'd never had and the woman she'd never been allowed to become because destiny had other plans, because her mother had chosen to keep her, because someone had decided she was the one who should carry the weight while her sister got to be ordinary. The mirror showed her more, and she couldn't look away, couldn't stop watching even though each new vision hurt. Even though every glimpse of the life she didn't live felt like a blade sliding between her ribs. Even though she knew on some level that this was poison. That this was exactly the kind of dangerous magic Morgan had warned against. That this was destroying her ability to be content with the life she actually had, by showing her constantly what she'd lost, what she'd been denied, what choices made before she was old enough to have any say had stolen from her. But knowing something is poison doesn't always stop you from drinking it, especially when you're already hurt, already aching, already looking for escape from pain you can't name or address or fix through any means available to you. So she kept watching, kept returning to the mirror night after night, kept letting it show her the life that might have been while her actual life, her real responsibilities, her true purpose slowly began to fray at the edges, began to show the strain of her divided attention, began to suffer from her inability to be fully present because part of her was always with the mirror, always with the other Morwen, always in the life that had been denied to her. The obsession begins 3 days after finding the mirror. Morwen missed morning meditation for the first time in 15 years. She'd been up all night watching visions, watching the other Morwen celebrate her 16th birthday with friends and family, watching her receive simple gifts given with love, watching her dance at the village festival with easy grace and unself-conscious joy, watching her live a life that looked so effortless, so light, so free of the weight that pressed down on Morwen constantly, making even breathing feel like work sometimes, making even existing feel like burden she had to consciously choose to carry rather than something that happened naturally, automatically, without effort or decision. She'd fallen asleep just before dawn, still dressed, slumped against the wall beside the mirror, and when she woke the sun was already climbing toward noon, and her muscles ached from sleeping in such an awkward position, and her head throbbed with the particular pain that came from using too much magic for too long, without proper rest or food, or the basic care that bodies required regardless of how much you might wish to transcend physical needs, and exist purely as consciousness, as will, as purpose without the inconvenient demands of flesh. She dragged herself up and splashed water on her face, and tried to make herself presentable before anyone came looking for her. Before the priestesses who reported to her began to worry or question or wonder whether their high priestess was sick or injured or simply neglecting her duties in ways that would require intervention. Elaine found her before she made it out of her chambers, knocked on the door with the particular rhythm they'd developed as children playing games together before responsibility and destiny drove them onto different paths. Before Morwen became High Priestess and Elaine became Threshold Keeper. Before their roles separated them in ways that made simple sisterhood difficult, made casual intimacy nearly impossible, made every interaction carry weight of official positions rather than being just two women who happened to share blood and history. Morwen almost didn't answer, almost pretended she wasn't there. Almost let Elaine think she was away somewhere dealing with priestess business that didn't concern threshold keepers. But she opened the door because refusing would raise more questions than answering. Because Elaine was her sister before being anything else. Because some part of her wanted to confess what she'd found, wanted to share the burden of knowing what she'd lost. Wanted someone else to understand why she felt like she was drowning, even though nothing in her external life had changed. Even though by any objective measure, she had everything she was supposed to want. You missed meditation. Elaine's voice carried concern rather than judgment, worry rather than criticism. Are you sick? Did something happen? Morwen wanted to laugh at the question because yes, something had happened. Everything had happened. Her entire understanding of her life had been shattered and rebuilt and shattered again by watching visions of what might have been, by seeing with perfect clarity the price she'd paid for power, by understanding in her bones rather than just intellectually that every choice costs something and the choice to be extraordinary costs the ability to be ordinary, to be simple, to be unburdened by greatness. But she couldn't say that, couldn't explain, couldn't find words for the ache that had taken up residence in her chest since she'd first looked into the mirror and seen her own face smiling with joy she'd never felt. I'm fine. Just tired. Just needed extra sleep. The lie came easily because she'd been trained from childhood to maintain composure, to show only what she wanted others to see, to keep vulnerability private and present only strength to the world that looked to her for leadership, for certainty, for the assurance that someone knew what they were doing even when everything felt uncertain and unstable and like it might collapse at any moment. Elaine studied her face with the attention of someone who knew her well enough to recognize lies, who'd shared enough of life with her to understand her moods and patterns, who could see past the mask she showed everyone else because they were sisters before they were anything else, were family before they were priestess and threshold keeper, were bound by blood and shared history in ways that official positions couldn't fully override. You don't look fine. You look like you haven't slept in days. What's going on? Morwen wanted to tell her, wanted to drag her over to the corner where the mirror hid beneath its covering, wanted to show her the visions and say, look at what we lost, look at what I lost, look at the life I could have had if Mother had chosen differently, if fate had turned another direction, if the universe had been slightly less cruel in its distribution of burden and blessing. But she didn't because telling Elaine meant admitting she'd taken forbidden magic from the vaults without telling anyone. meant confessing she was using scrying mirrors in ways that Morwen had explicitly warned against, meant revealing weakness and obsession and inability to be content with the life she had, inability to maintain the gratitude and grace that a high priestess should demonstrate, inability to be the leader everyone needed her to be because she was too busy mourning a life that had never been hers to fully inhabit the life that was. Just a lot on my mind. Priestess things. Nothing you need to worry about. Another lie, smoother this time. Delivered with the authority of someone who was accustomed to making statements that wouldn't be questioned, who'd learned to use position and title to shut down inquiry, who'd discovered that being high priestess meant people accepted what you said even when they suspected it wasn't entirely true, even when they saw through to the pain or confusion or uncertainty underneath, because challenging authority was difficult and most people preferred to take you at your word rather than push past your defenses to demand real truth, real vulnerability. Real admission that you were struggling and didn't have all the answers, and weren't as strong as everyone needed you to be. Elaine looked at her a moment longer, clearly unconvinced but also clearly unwilling to push harder, unwilling to violate the unspoken agreement they'd developed over years that some things stayed private, that some struggles were born alone. That sisterhood meant respecting boundaries even when you suspected your sister was in pain, even when you wanted to help but couldn't figure out how. If you need anything, she said finally. If you want to talk, I'm here. Then she was gone, leaving Morwen alone with her lie and her mirror and the growing awareness that she was slipping, losing her grip on the life she'd built. Letting obsession consume the focus and dedication that had defined her for decades. Letting envy poison the satisfaction she'd once taken in her work. Letting the fantasy of what might have been destroy her ability to be present for what actually was. She should have stopped then. Should have covered the mirror permanently. Should have returned it to the vaults, or destroyed it, or done anything except what she actually did, which was wait until she was sure Elaine was gone and then return to it, pull away the covering, touch the dark surface and let the visions flow. Let herself sink into the life of the other Morwen who was preparing now for something significant, something life-changing, something that made her mother self feel simultaneously happy and terrified in ways that suggested this was a threshold moment, a turning point, a transformation that would shape everything that came after. The vision clarified and Morwen saw the other Morwen meeting someone. A young man with carpenter's hands and kind eyes, saw them talking in the village square, saw something spark between them. Saw the beginning of the thing that would eventually become love, partnership, family. All the ordinary magical things that most people took for granted but that priestesses sacrificed, that high priestesses never experienced, that Morwen had traded away without really understanding what she was trading. Until she saw it playing out in front of her. Saw her other self falling in love with the casual ease of someone who'd never been told that attachment was weakness, that relationships were distraction, that the path to power required walking alone. She watched and felt something break inside her, felt some essential piece of her understanding of her own life crack and shift and reveal itself to be less stable than she'd believed, less certain, less adequate to sustain her through the years and decades and eventual centuries that stretched ahead of her if she continued on this path, if she remained high priestess, if she kept making the choices that duty demanded rather than the choices that might lead to happiness, to joy, to the simple, human warmth of being loved by someone who saw you not as leader or priestess or repository of ancient knowledge, but as simply yourself, as person, as woman who deserved tenderness and care, and the everyday magic of being chosen not for what you could do, but for who you were. The parallel lives 2 months after finding the mirror, and Morwen's life had split in two. There was the life she lived during the day, the one where she performed her duties as High Priestess with acceptable competence, if not her former excellence, where she led rituals and taught novices and made decisions about Avalon's management with enough presence of mind that no one questioned her fitness for the role, even if they noticed she seemed distracted, seemed distant, seemed less engaged than she used to be in the small daily details that had once consumed her attention. And then there was the life she lived at night, the one where she disappeared into her chambers the moment evening duties were done, where she locked her door and pulled the covering from the mirror and sank into visions of what might have been, where she watched the other Morwen live the life that had been denied to her and felt alternately grief and envy and rage and strange vicarious joy at watching someone with her face experience things she never would. The other Morwen's courtship was proceeding with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing, of seeds sprouting, of all things that followed natural patterns without needing to be forced or controlled or managed. The young carpenter, whose name was Thomas, came calling regularly, sat with her family, made simple conversation that revealed depth of character rather than depth of learning, demonstrated steadiness and kindness and good humor rather than brilliance or ambition or any of the qualities that made people remarkable but also often made them difficult, made them dangerous, made them poor choices for partnership, because extraordinary people required extraordinary amounts of accommodation, extraordinary patience, extraordinary willingness to be secondary to their primary purpose. Thomas was ordinary in the best sense, was someone who would be faithful and present and committed, who would show up day after day, who would build a life through accumulation of small choices rather than dramatic gestures, who would love steadily rather than passionately, but steadily was perhaps more valuable in the long run, more sustainable, more likely to last through the inevitable difficulties that came with building shared existence. Morwen watched them together and tried to imagine what it would feel like to be the center of someone's attention in that way. To be chosen not for magical ability or political value, but for self, for personality, for the simple fact of existing and being who you were without needing to perform or achieve or demonstrate worth through accomplishment. She'd never had that, never even come close. The few relationships she'd attempted in her 20s had been complicated by her position, by the power differential between High Priestess and anyone else on Avalon, by the fact that people approached her with agendas and calculations and awareness of what it might mean, politically or socially, to be involved with her. No one had ever looked at her the way Thomas looked at the other Morwen, with simple, uncomplicated appreciation, with joy at her presence that didn't require her to be anything other than herself, with love that asked for nothing except the opportunity to share time and space and build something together. The day of the wedding arrived in the mirror's visions, and Morwen watched with attention so complete she forgot to breathe, forgot to blink, forgot everything except the images flowing across the dark glass. The other Morwen, in a simple white dress that had probably taken months to sew and save for, that represented sacrifice and preparation and communal effort, because in villages everyone contributed to weddings. Everyone brought what they could. Everyone participated in celebrating the formation of new family unit that would eventually contribute children and labor and continuity to the community's ongoing existence. her face glowing with happiness that needed no performance, no maintenance, no conscious effort to sustain because it flowed from within, from genuine joy at the moment, from love for the man standing beside her, from anticipation of the life they would build together. And Thomas looking at her like she was the answer to questions he'd been asking his whole life, like she was home and adventure, and everything worth having all contained in one person. Like marrying her was not compromise or obligation or sensible choice but privilege, gift, incredible fortune that he couldn't quite believe had been granted to him. The ceremony was simple, conducted by the village priest using words that Morwen, as priestess, would have found constraining and reductive, that reduced divine mystery to moral instruction, that framed marriage as duty and obligation rather than as sacred partnership. But the people gathered there didn't seem to mind, seemed to find comfort in the familiar ritual, seemed to take joy in witnessing two of their own making commitment, promising faithfulness, choosing to bind their futures together in ways that would affect the whole community, because communities were networks, were webs of connection, were systems where each relationship mattered and contributed to the strength and stability of the whole. Morwen watched the celebration after, watched the other Morwen dance with her new husband, watched them surrounded by friends and family who loved them without agenda, without calculation, without wondering how this marriage might affect broader political or social dynamics. She watched and understood with sickening clarity that this was what she'd lost. Not just partnership or romance or physical intimacy, but belonging. Being woven into community so tightly that your joy was everyone's joy. Your struggles were shared struggles. Your life mattered not because of what you achieved, but because you were part of the fabric that held everything together. On Avalon she had respect, had authority, had power that let her shape events and determine outcomes. But she didn't have this. Had never had this. Would never have this, because the price of being High Priestess was being separate, being above, being the one who stood slightly apart even in the middle of gatherings, because her position required distance, required objectivity, required her to make decisions that might hurt individuals for the benefit of the collective, might sacrifice personal relationships for strategic necessity. Time moved in the mirror, and Morwen watched the other Morwen grow into her new life, watched her settle into partnership, watched her belly swell with pregnancy, watched her become mother in the most literal sense, creating new life, bringing child into the world through pain and effort that Morwen had never experienced and never would experience, because priestesses didn't have children, because the path she'd been set on required celibacy, or at least childlessness, required her body and her time and her energy to be fully devoted to Avalon, to the work, to maintaining the old ways, and training the next generation of priestesses who would be her legacy, who would carry forward what she taught, who would remember her name long after she was gone, but who would never call her mother, would never know her with the intimate completeness that children knew parents, would never love her with the uncomplicated devotion that she saw in the eyes of the infant the other Morwen held, that she heard in the cries that demanded attention and care without doubt or hesitation or concern for whether the demand was convenient or wanted. The other Morwen's life wasn't perfect. Morwen could see that, could see the exhaustion of caring for infant, could see the strain in her marriage when money was tight, could see the small difficulties and frustrations that came with living in close quarters with family, with balancing needs of child and partner and self when there was never quite enough time or energy or resources to satisfy everyone. Could see that this life had its own kinds of pain, its own challenges, its own moments of despair when the other Morwen sat alone, crying from exhaustion or frustration, or the overwhelming weight of being responsible for keeping tiny fragile human alive through nothing but her own attention and care. But even the hard parts looked better to Morwen than what she had, looked more meaningful, looked like they were building towards something that mattered in ways she was beginning to doubt. Her own work mattered, ways she was beginning to question whether maintaining Avalon and preserving the old ways justified the loneliness, the isolation, the lack of simple human warmth that other people took for granted. She watched the other Morwen's child grow, watched her teach her daughter to read and sew and cook, watched her expand her family with a second child and then a third. Watched her become the center of web of relationships that spread through the village, that made her essential, not through power or knowledge but through connection, through being the person people came to for advice or help or simply companionship, through building a life that was rich in meaning even if it would never be remembered by history, even if no one would ever tell stories about her. Even if her name would be forgotten within a generation or two after her death. And Morwen looked at her own life, at the power she wielded and the respect she commanded and the legacy she would leave, and found herself wondering for the first time whether she'd made the right choice, whether being extraordinary was worth the price of never being ordinary, whether greatness justified loneliness. Whether this was what she actually wanted or just what she'd been told to want, trained to want, shaped to want by a mother who'd decided before Morwen was old enough to have opinions that this would be her path, her purpose, her life, whether she wanted it or not. The comparison was poison, and she knew it was destroying her ability to find satisfaction in her actual existence. Knew it was stealing whatever joy she might have found in her work by constantly showing her what she'd lost, what she'd traded away, what had been decided for her before she understood what was being decided. But knowing something is destroying you and being able to stop it are very different things. And Morwen found she couldn't stop, couldn't look away. Couldn't give up the nightly ritual of sinking into visions of the life she'd never lived. Couldn't release her grip on the fantasy even though it was crushing the reality, even though it was making her actual life unbearable by comparison, even though every glimpse of the other Morwen's ordinary happiness made her own extraordinary loneliness more acute, more painful. More impossible to ignore or dismiss or pretend was acceptable price for power and purpose and all. The things she was supposed to value more than simple human connection. The confrontation internal for months after finding the mirror, and Morwen began to fantasize about switching places. Not physically, not literally. Because even in her obsession, she understood that such things were impossible, that reality didn't work that way, that you couldn't simply step through a mirror and exchange one life for another, like trading clothes. But she found herself thinking about what would be required, what magic might make it possible. What cost she might be willing to pay to undo the choice that had been made before she was old enough to participate, to reverse the decision that had set her on this path, to become the Morwen who'd been given away instead of the Morwen who'd been kept. She started researching, pulling books from the restricted sections of the library, studying texts that dealt with reality alteration, with changing what was to what might have been, with magic so dangerous that Morgan had warned her to never even contemplate, using it because the price was always higher than you expected, and the consequences were always worse than you anticipated. She learned that time was less fixed than most people believed, that reality branched at every moment of choice, that somewhere in the vast space of possible worlds, every potential outcome existed and was as real as any other from the perspective of the multiverse, even if only one was real from the perspective of the person experiencing it. She learned that there were ways to reach across those branches, to touch other possibilities, to glimpse how things might have gone differently if different choices had been made at crucial moments. She learned that some practitioners of the most forbidden magic had claimed they could do more than glimpse, could actually shift consciousness between branches, could wake up in different versions of reality and leave their current existence behind, like shedding clothes. She learned these things and felt hope kindle in her chest, felt desperate hunger grow, felt obsession shift from passive watching to active planning, to considering what she might actually do, what she might actually attempt, what she might actually sacrifice to escape the life that felt increasingly like prison, like trap, like cage she'd been placed in before she understood what she was agreeing to. But the texts also contained warnings, accounts of what happened to practitioners who'd attempted such magic, descriptions of consequences that made her blood run cold, even as part of her insisted it would be different for her, insisted she was smarter and better trained and more capable than those who'd failed, insisted she could succeed where others had failed because she had to, because the alternative was spending the rest of her life knowing what she'd lost, knowing what she could have, knowing that somewhere across the boundary between possible worlds there existed a version of her who had everything she wanted, and that the only thing separating them was an accident of circumstance, a choice made by someone else, a decision she'd had no part in that had nevertheless determined the entire shape of her existence. People who attempted to shift between realities often lost themselves in the process, the texts warned. Consciousness wasn't designed to move between fundamentally different contexts, wasn't meant to inhabit multiple versions of self simultaneously, wasn't stable enough to survive the strain of remembering being two completely different people with incompatible histories and experiences. Those who tried often came back fractured, unable to distinguish what had been real in which reality, unable to maintain coherent sense of identity, unable to function because they couldn't remember which memories belonged to which version of themselves, which relationships were real in this world, which knowledge they'd actually gained as opposed to knowledge that belonged to the other self they'd briefly occupied. Some went mad, minds broken by attempting to hold too many truths simultaneously. Some simply disappeared, perhaps successfully completing the transfer, or perhaps lost in the space between worlds, trapped in some liminal state, neither here nor there but suspended in the boundary. And even if the transfer succeeded, even if consciousness moved cleanly from one reality to another, even if you woke up in the other world with all your memories intact and your sense of self preserved, there was still the question of what happened to the consciousness already there, to the version of yourself you were attempting to displace, to the person whose life you were trying to claim as your own. The texts were unclear on this point, or perhaps deliberately vague, offering theories that ranged from displacement to merger to annihilation, from the other consciousness being pushed into your abandoned reality to both consciousnesses, somehow coexisting in fractured harmony, to one simply ceasing to exist entirely, erased from reality as if they'd never been, sacrificed so that you could have what you wanted. Morwen told herself she didn't care, that the other Morwen that kept one, the chosen one, the one who'd been given everything, wouldn't suffer from being displaced into a life of studying in solitude, wouldn't mind trading places, might even prefer the quiet certainty of the path Morwen currently walked, to whatever complications came with being the beloved daughter, instead of the scholarly one. She told herself this, constructed elaborate justifications, built careful rationalizations for why it would be acceptable, why it would be fair, why it would merely be correcting an injustice rather than perpetrating a new one. But late at night, when the mirror showed her the other Morwen, laughing with Morgan, being embraced by her mother, living the life that should have been hers, Morwen couldn't quite silence the voice that asked whether she was really any different from the mother who'd made the original choice, who'd decided which daughter to keep and which to give away, who'd determined the shape of both their lives without consulting either of them, who'd valued one child over another for reasons Morwen still didn't fully understand. Wasn't she proposing to do the same thing? To make a choice for someone else, to determine the course of another person's existence, to decide that her desires mattered more than someone else's reality. The thought made her sick. The thought made her furious. The thought made her more determined than ever, because if she was already poisoned by the original choice, already twisted by the injustice done to her, already made monstrous by circumstances beyond her control, then what did it matter if she completed the transformation? What did it matter if she became the villain in someone else's story, when she'd already been cast as the tragic figure in her own? She began to gather the components the texts required. Rare herbs harvested under specific lunar phases, crystals charged with emotional resonance. Blood, of course there was always blood in the most powerful magic. Sacrifice made tangible, cost made visible. She prepared the ritual space in the deepest part of the house, a room she'd claimed for her own research. A room Morgan never entered because Morwen had made it clear that some boundaries were not to be crossed. Some privacy was not to be violated. Some parts of her life were hers alone, even if everything else had been determined by other people's choices. The ritual itself was complex, requiring precise timing, exact pronunciation, perfect execution of each gesture and invocation. One mistake could mean failure. One error could mean something worse than failure, transformation into something neither here nor there. Consciousness scattered across multiple realities. Existence reduced to fragmented awareness trapped in the spaces between worlds. But Morwen had always been good at following instructions, had always excelled at academic precision, had always been the one who could master the most difficult techniques, because she had the discipline and focus that came from having nothing else to distract her, no relationships to maintain, no social obligations to fulfill, no life outside her studies to demand her attention. She waited until Morgan was away on one of his frequent journeys, gone for days to consult with colleagues or research obscure texts in distant libraries. She waited until the house was empty, until she was alone with the mirror and her obsession and her carefully prepared ritual space. She waited until the astronomical conditions aligned, until the moment the texts specified as most conducive to reality alteration, until everything was exactly as it needed to be. And then, standing before the mirror with the ritual components arranged around her, with the words of power memorized and ready, with the sacrifice prepared and the intention crystallized into single-minded focus, Morwen hesitated. Not from fear, not from doubt about the magic itself, but from a sudden, clear realization that cut through her obsession like light through fog. She was looking at the mirror, at the other Morwen, who was, at that exact moment, also looking back. And in that moment of perfect synchronization, Morwen understood something the texts hadn't told her, something she'd been too consumed by her own desire to see clearly until now. The other Morwen was also obsessed, was also watching, was also consumed by what she saw in the mirror. But what the other Morwen saw was not a beloved daughter and a life of ease. What the other Morwen saw was freedom from expectation, solitude instead of constant demands, the ability to study without interruption, the luxury of pursuing knowledge for its own sake without the burden of being someone's precious daughter, someone's emotional support, someone's replacement for what they'd lost. The other Morwen looked at her and saw escape. Morwen stared at her, reflection, or was it a reflection, or was it another person entirely, and saw her own desperation mirrored back at her, not reflected, mirrored, duplicated, the same obsession, the same hunger, the same absolute certainty that the life on the other side of the glass was the one worth having. Both of them wanted to trade places. Both of them were convinced the other had what they lacked. Both of them were willing to sacrifice the person on the other side to get what they wanted. Both of them were prepared to perform the ritual at exactly the same moment. Morwen's hands began to shake. The ritual components suddenly felt heavy, oppressive, wrong. Because she understood now what the texts hadn't said explicitly, what she'd been too blinded by her own pain to recognize. The grass wasn't greener on the other side. There was no perfect version of her life waiting on the other side of the mirror. There was just another person, another Morwen, another daughter who'd been hurt by the same choice in different ways, who'd learned to resent what she'd been given just as thoroughly as Morwen resented what she'd been denied. The choice their mother had made hadn't created a winner and a loser. It had created two losers, two daughters who'd each been given only part of what they needed. Two people who'd spent their lives convinced the other had gotten the better deal. Two versions of the same person who'd become so focused on what they lacked that they couldn't see the value in what they had. And if they switched places, if they somehow managed to successfully complete the ritual and exchange realities, they'd just be trading one set of problems for another. The other Morwen would discover that solitude wasn't freedom, that being left alone meant being lonely, that having space to study meant having no one who cared about what you learned. And Morwen would discover that being loved came with expectations, that being valued meant being needed, that being someone's daughter meant carrying the weight of their hopes and fears and disappointments. They'd switch places, and eventually both of them would be staring into mirrors again, desperate to trade back, convinced they'd made a terrible mistake. Morwen lowered her hands. The ritual components remained unused, the words of power unspoken, the sacrifice unheard. In the mirror, the other Morwen also lowered her hands, also stepped back from her own prepared ritual space, also recognized the futility of what they'd both been planning. They stood there, separated by whatever boundary the mirror represented, and for the first time since Morwen had discovered its existence, they simply looked at each other, not with envy, not with hunger, just with recognition. Two people who'd been hurt the same way and had responded by hurting themselves, by fixating on an impossible solution, by convincing themselves that somewhere else was better than here. Morwen raised one hand and pressed it flat against the mirror's surface. On the other side, the other Morwen did the same, palm to palm, separated by glass or magic or the fundamental boundary between possible worlds. They stood together in shared understanding. Then Morwen turned away from the mirror, left the ritual space, and went upstairs to the main part of the house. She sat in Morgan's study, in the chair by the window where he often read in the evenings, and waited for him to return. She had things she needed to say to him, questions she needed to ask, conversations they should have had years ago, but she'd been too angry and hurt and obsessed to initiate. She still didn't have the life she wanted. She still didn't have the mother who'd chosen to keep her. She still didn't have the easy love and affection she'd seen through the mirror. But she had Morgan, who'd taken her in and taught her and given her space to become herself, even if that self was difficult and prickly and obsessed with things best left alone. She had knowledge and skill and power that she'd earned through her own effort. She had choices ahead of her, a future she could shape, possibilities that didn't require destroying someone else to claim. She had her own life, imperfect, painful, scarred by choices made before she could consent to them, but hers nonetheless. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Because the alternative was spending forever staring through mirrors at other possible lives, other possible selves, other possible worlds where everything was better or where everything just hurt in different ways. When Morgan returned 3 days later, he found her reading in his study. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment they just regarded each other, uncle and niece, teacher and student, two people bound together by someone else's choice, but who'd built something real nonetheless. "I need to talk to you about my mother," Morwen said. "About why she gave me away. About what really happened. I need the whole truth, not the edited version you've been giving me all these years." Morgan set down his travel bag and sighed, looking suddenly older and more tired than she'd ever seen him. "All right," he said, "I suppose it's past time." "But Morwen, I know," she interrupted. "I know it's going to hurt. I know it's not going to be the answer I want. But I need to know anyway, because I can't spend the rest of my life obsessed with what might have been. I need to understand what actually is, what actually happened, so I can finally let it go and move forward." Morgan studied her face, searching for something. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly and settled into the chair across from her. "Then I'll tell you," he said. "Everything, but first, you should probably destroy whatever ritual space you've been building in the basement. I'm not as oblivious as you think, and some magics leave traces visible to those who know where to look." Morwen felt her face flush, but she didn't look away. "I'm not going to use it," she said. "I realized it wouldn't actually solve anything." "Good," Morgan said quietly, "because you're right. It wouldn't. Now, about your mother." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and then began to tell her the truth she'd spent 4 months seeking in all the wrong places. The end.